The land kept its secrets buried deep, under layers of frost-cracked stone and the patient dust of ages. Corbin knew this. He had come to this high, lonely valley to bury his own. He was a man made of edges and silence, his face a map of some private, unforgiving territory. His cabin was less a home than a hermitage, wedged into a crease of the mountainside like a splinter in God's thumb, overlooking a land he had once tried to tame and had failed. It was in the season of the long shadows, when the sun bled out, early behind the granite peaks, that he found the warrior. The creek was a vein of black water sluggish with ice, its banks tattooed with the skeletal remains of autumn. At first, Corbin thought it was a fallen stag, a dark heap against the gray stones. Then he saw the quiver, fanned with hawk feathers, and the glint of beadwork on a buckskin sleeve. He moved closer, his hand resting on the worn grip of the hunting knife at his belt, a habit he couldn't break. The man was Lakota, his face a mask of dried blood and grim endurance. A dark, wet stain, impossibly large, spread from his side, melting the thin crust of snow beneath him. His breathing was a ragged whisper of effort, each exhalation a small, pained cloud in the frigid air. He was not old, but his eyes held the ancient patience of the mountains themselves. They were fixed on something beyond Corbin, something past the pain. Then Corbin saw what the warrior was guarding. Huddled in the hollow of the man's body, shielded from the wind, was a child. A girl, no more than 6 or 7 winters old, her face streaked with tears that had frozen to her cheeks. She was wrapped in the warrior's own buffalo robe, a small, trembling bundle of life, cocooned by the dying. She stared at Corbin with eyes that were not a child's eyes. They were black, bottomless, and held no fear, only a terrible knowing. Stillness. She clutched a single perfect eagle feather in her tiny fist. Corbin's breath caught in his throat, a sharp, painful thing. The air here was thin, but this was different. This was the theft of air, the vacuum left by a memory. He saw another face in the child's, a ghost of a face with blue eyes and hair the color of corn silk, a face he saw every time he closed his own eyes. Sarah. The name was a wound that never scarred over. The warrior's gaze shifted, landing on Corbin with a weight that felt physical. There was no hatred in it. There was only a question. His lips, cracked and blue, parted. A single word, a name, escaped on a dying breath, a sound meant for a woman's ear, not his. Ampodu. The name hung in the air, sacred and strange. Then the warrior's eyes lost their focus, gazing into the vast and different gray of the sky. A shudder ran through his powerful frame, a final tremor, and he was still. The silence that followed was absolute. It was deeper than the quiet of the snow-dusted forest. It was the silence of a life extinguished, a promise broken. The child did not cry. She simply watched the last of the life leave the man who had been her shield, her world. Corbin knew the cost. He saw the cavalry issue arrowhead lodged high in the man's shoulder, a detail that made the acid of bile rise in his throat. He saw the brutal, unmistakable gash of a saber cut across his ribs. This was not the work of bandits or rival tribes. This was the work of the United States Army, his work, or the work of men he once called brothers. To touch this child, to interfere, was to invite a reckoning from both sides of a war he had fled. The soldiers would see a traitor. The Lakota would see a thief, a killer stealing their dead and their living. He looked at the girl, her small face a sculpture of stoic grief. He looked at the vast, empty wilderness around them, a place that could kill a grown man in a single night, let alone a child. Leaving her was a death sentence. Taking her was another kind. He knelt, the cold of the snow seeping through the knee of his canvas trousers. He didn't think, he acted. It was a reflex born not of heroism, but of a debt he could never repay. A penance for the ghost of his own daughter. He gently reached for the child. She flinched, but did not pull away. Her eyes, those ancient, dark pools, held his. "It's all right," he whispered, the words sounding hollow and foolish in the immense silence. "I won't hurt you." He gathered her up. She was lighter than a sack of flour, a fragile collection of bones and spirit. As he stood, cradling her against his chest, a lone hawk cried out from the highest crag, its call echoing down the valley, a sharp, piercing sound that felt like a judgment or a prophecy. The warrior lay still, his face turned to the sky, the name he had whispered seeming to cling to the frozen air like a prayer Corbin had no right to have heard. The cabin was a testament to a man trying to erase himself. The walls were rough-hewn pine, the floor packed earth. There was one room, one stone fireplace, one bed of straw and wool blankets. The only ghosts permitted here were Corbin's own, and they were jealous gods. Now there was another. He placed the child on the worn rawhide chair by the hearth. She slid off it immediately and went to the darkest corner of the room, pulling the buffalo robe tighter around her, and sat with her back to the wall. She was a small, defiant island of sorrow in his sea of solitude. He built up the fire, the flames licking at the dry logs, casting dancing shadows that made the small space feel both smaller and more haunted. She stared at the fire, but not with the childlike wonder he expected. She watched it with a grim intensity, as if she were seeing not warmth, but destruction, as if she remembered it consuming something or someone. Corbin was no hero. The proof was locked in a small iron box beneath his cot. A Colt revolver, cavalry issue. A tarnished silver locket with a faded daguerreotype of a woman and a child. And his discharge papers, signed by a man whose name was a curse on the northern plains, Colonel John Sibley. Corbin had ridden with the 7th. He had been at the Washita. He hadn't pulled a trigger on women or children, but he had held the horses. He had followed the orders that led to the smoke and the screaming. His hands were clean of the blood, but his soul was stained with the soot. He had been cast out not for cowardice, but for a moment of defiant humanity. An order to fire on a group of fleeing old men, and he had aimed his rifle at the sky. The public disgrace was a court-martial for insubordination. The private one was the look in Sibley's eyes, a cold, dismissive contempt for a man who had lost his nerve. He had lost more than that. He had lost his faith in the world of men. He came here to this mountain to live with the verdict. The child in his cabin was a living piece of that verdict. She was the other side of the order he had refused. He looked at the intricate beadwork on her moccasins, the delicate pattern of a bluebird in flight. Someone's mother, someone's sister, had sewn that with love and prayer. Someone whose village might have been turned to ash by men like him. He moved about the cabin with a quiet purpose that felt alien to him now. He heated broth, the smell of salted venison filling the small space. He set a wooden bowl on the floor, a safe distance from her corner. He said nothing. Words were useless things. She didn't move for an hour. Then, with the slow, deliberate motion of a wild creature, she crept forward. She sniffed at the bowl, her small nose wrinkling. She glanced at him, her eyes narrowed with suspicion, then back at the steam rising from the broth. Finally, she dipped a finger in, tasted it, and then, cupping the bowl in both hands, she drank. He turned away, giving her the privacy of her survival. He busied himself cleaning. His rifle, the familiar scent of oil and steel, a small, cold comfort. When he looked back, the bowl was empty. She was back in her corner, the eagle feather held tight in her lap. He noticed something then, a small tear in the buffalo robe near the collar. Tucked inside, almost hidden, was a piece of dark blue wool, a soldier's coat, the color of the cavalry. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter outside. He'd found that tattered fabric clutched in the dead warrior's hand. He hadn't buried the warrior. The ground was frozen solid. He had covered him with stones, a makeshift cairn on the bank of the creek, a small, inadequate gesture of respect. He had taken nothing but the child. But the warrior had been carrying this scrap of cloth. The girl would not speak. She made no sound at all, not a whimper, not a sigh. The silence in the cabin became a third presence, a living entity woven. From her grief and his guilt, two wounds, one shelter. His, a festering shame for what he had been a part of. Hers, a fresh, clean cut of loss, absolute and pure. Their silences clashed in the firelight, echoing with unspoken histories, with the thunder of hooves and the lullabies of mothers, a terrible, deafening conversation that needed no words. He was a ghost haunted by the past. She was a ghost haunted by the present. And under his roof, the two worlds bled into one another, turning the air thick with the weight of all that was unsaid, and all that could never be undone. Days bled into a week. The snow fell, a soft, relentless curtain that sealed the valley from the rest-off world. Time in the cabin slowed to the rhythm of the girl's breathing and the crackle of the fire. Corbin fell into a routine that felt both sacred and profane. He was nursing a child of the people his own had tried to erase. He found a salve in a small tin, made of pine sap and bear grease, a remedy an old trapper had taught him years ago. He had used it on his own daughters. Scrapes. The memory was a knife twist, but he pushed it down. One evening, when the girl finally succumbed to an exhausted sleep, he gently dabbed the salve on the raw, chapped skin of her face. She stirred, a small murmur escaping her lips, but she didn't wake. In the morning, he saw the redness had faded, a small victory, but it felt monumental. The piece of blue cavalry wool was a burning coal in his pocket. One afternoon, while the girl watched the snow fall through the single glass pane of his window, he took the fabric outside. He dug a small hole in the snow behind the cabin and buried it deep in the frozen earth. A ridiculous, symbolic act. Burying the evidence, burying his own past. When he came back inside, she was looking at him, and for the first time, her expression was not one of stoicism, but of questioning. She knew. She had seen him. He tried to find a way into her silence. He spoke to her in low tones, not expecting answers. He told her about the deer that stripped bark from the aspens, about the way the ice sang when the temperature dropped suddenly. He took out his carving knife and a block of pine and began to whittle. Slowly, a shape emerged. A small bird, its wings half spread. He sanded it smooth with a piece of worn leather and set it on the floor near her. She watched it for a long time. She did not touch it. The next evening, as the fire burned low, a new sound entered the cabin. It was faint at first, a low hum, almost imperceptible. Corbin froze, listening. It was the girl. Her eyes were closed, and she was humming a tune. It wasn't a child's song. It was a lament, a melody that seemed to carry the weight of the wind sweeping over 1,000 miles of prairie. It was ancient and sorrowful and deeply unnerving. He realized with a jolt that she was not humming for him, or even for herself. She was looking toward the snow-covered window, toward the vast, listening world outside. The song was a call, a message sent out into the white silence. He felt a prickle of fear then, a deep, primal instinct that the fragile peace of their strange cohabitation was about to be shattered. The silence had been a shield. The sound was a signal. That night, he dreamt. He was standing on a ridge, overlooking a valley filled with smoke. The smell of burning lodges and scorched earth was thick in his throat. Below, he saw the blue uniforms of the 7th Cavalry moving like beetles through the destruction. He heard a child crying, a sound that morphed into the cry of his own daughter, Sarah. He tried to run towards the sound, but his feet were rooted to the earth. He was forced to watch, a helpless monument to his own damnation. He woke up with a gasp, the smell of smoke still sharp in his nostrils. Though the cabin was cold, the fire having died to embers, the girl was awake. She was sitting up, staring at him from her corner. In the pale pre-dawn light filtering through the window, her dark eyes seemed to glow. She held the small wooden bird he had carved in one hand and the eagle feather in the other. She did something then that broke the spell of the week-long silence. She pointed a small finger towards the window, towards the ridge overlooking his cabin, and then she spoke. One word, a name he did not recognize, whispered with a reverence that made the hair on his arms stand up. Inyang. He went to the door, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He pushed it open a crack, the frigid air a slap in the face. The world outside was a canvas of gray and white, the landscape softened and silenced by the fresh snow. The air was unnaturally still, and on the ridge, the one from his dream, stood a figure. A single rider on a pinto pony, a silhouette against the bruised dawn sky, motionless, watching. Corbin's blood ran cold. The humming had been answered. The quiet before the storm was over. The storm had come. He stood at the threshold of his cabin, the cold seeping into his bones, and watched the dawn break, not with light, but with men. The single rider on the ridge was not a scout, but an anchor. From the folds of the land, from the ghostly mists that clung to the pine-choked draws, they emerged. First 5, then 10, appearing as if materialized from the snow itself. They were on foot and on horseback, their movements silent, fluid, a river of dark shapes pouring into the valley. They did not rush, they did not shout. They simply came, their presence a suffocating weight that pressed the air from the world. Soon there were 20, then 50, then more than he could count. They formed a wide, silent crescent around his small patch of land, their faces impassive, their eyes fixed on his cabin. It was not an army come for war. It was a glacier unstoppable and absolute, come to reclaim what was its own. The very land went quiet. The chattering of a squirrel, the call of a winter bird, all of it ceased. The only sound was the frantic, hammering thunder of Corbin's own heart. He saw war lances adorned with feathers and scalps. He saw bows and old trade rifles. He saw faces that were hard-bitten and unforgiving, and others that were lined with a sorrow so deep it looked like geology. From the center of the crescent, a man dismounted. He was older than the rest, his long hair braided with silver and strips of otter fur. His face was a masterpiece of dignity and time, each line a story, each scar a memory. He did not swagger. He walked with a slow, deliberate grace, his moccasins making no sound on the fresh snow. A young boy of about 14 walked beside him, the man's hand resting gently on his shoulder. This was power, this was history, this was judgment. This, Corbin knew, must be Inyang, the name the girl had whispered. The chief. Corbin stepped out of the cabin, leaving the door open behind him. He held his hands out, open and empty, to show he was unarmed. The gesture felt pitiful, inadequate. The girl, Viaka, came to the doorway and stood there, clutching the wooden bird. When she saw the chief, a light came into her eyes. She took a hesitant step forward. The chief's gaze swept past her, landing on Corbin with an intensity that pinned him in place. It was not a look of hate, but of profound, soul-deep scrutiny. He was being weighed, measured, and found wanting. One of the warriors beside the chief, a man with a fearsome scar across his cheek, spoke. His voice was not loud, but it carried across the snow-filled silence with perfect clarity, each Lakota word sharp and crystalline in the cold air. The chief raised a hand, and the man fell silent. Inyang would speak for himself. He stopped 20 paces from Corbin. His eyes, dark and piercing, held Corbin's. They seemed to see everything, the cavalry uniform locked in the box, the ghost of the daughter, the shame that was the bedrock of Corbin's existence. Then he spoke, his voice low and resonant, like stones shifting at the bottom of a river. He did not speak in Lakota. He spoke in the clipped, halting English of the trading posts. a language he clearly disdained but used as a tool. "You have a child of the Sikanu." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. "And you built a stone pile for one of our dead." Corbin could only nod, his throat too tight to form words. "Matotanka," the chief said, the name of the warrior. A heavy stone dropped into the silence. "He was my daughter's husband," the air crackled. The weight of 50 silent witnesses pressed down. This was not just a child. This was the chief's own granddaughter. "You touched one of ours," Inyangmani said, his voice flat, emotionless. The phrase hung in the air, a simple truth that held a universe of consequence. "You have interfered. You have crossed a line that was not yours to cross. You have entered our story." In that moment, Corbin understood. This was not a negotiation. It was not a parley. It was the closing of a circle that had begun long before he built this cabin, long before he had fled the army. It had begun the day he first put on the blue uniform. Fear was a part of it, a cold knot in his stomach. But something else rose to meet it, a sense of inevitability, of rightness. This was the reckoning he had been running from. He had come to this mountain seeking solitude and found judgment instead. Slowly, deliberately, Corbin lowered himself to one knee in the snow. He bowed his head. It was not an act of fear. It was not a plea for mercy. It was an act of surrender to a power greater than his own, an acknowledgement of a debt he could not comprehend but knew he owed. It was an apology made not with words, but with his own body, an atonement. He knelt in the snow, the cold forgotten, and waited for the verdict. The world held its breath. The silence was complete, and then he felt a small, hesitant touch. He looked up. The girl Viaka had walked from the doorway to his side. She placed her small, cold hand on his bowed head, a benediction. Or a claim. They did not bind him. They did not drag him. They simply turned and began to walk, and he was expected to follow. The chief, Inyangmani, walked ahead with Viaka's hand in his. The silent warriors fell in around Corbin, a moving wall of flesh and spirit. He walked as a man in a dream, leaving his cabin, his solitude, his entire failed existence behind. Their camp was hidden in a deep, wooded canyon, sheltered from the wind and invisible from the plains. It was larger than he expected, a sprawling village of hide lodges, the smoke from their fires rising straight and thin into the cold air. The entire village emptied to see them arrive. Faces peered from lodge flaps, women, children, old men. Their eyes were on him, a mixture of curiosity, grief, and a hard, deep-seated anger. He was the enemy, walking into the heart of their world. He kept his eyes down, fixed on the trampled snow, a prisoner not of ropes but of his own history. They led him to a large lodge at the center of the camp, the council lodge. Inside, a fire burned, and the elders of the tribe were seated in a circle. Inyangmani took his place and gestured for Corbin to sit opposite him on a simple buffalo robe spread on the ground, the position of a guest or a man on trial. He did not know which. Viaka was taken away by a woman whose face was a mask of sorrow, her eyes red-rimmed from weeping but filled with a fierce, formidable strength. She wore a dress of white doeskin, intricately beaded. She looked at Corbin once, a long searching gaze that held the grief of a widow and the pride of a chief's daughter. This, he knew, was Npw, the woman whose name the warrior had whispered with his last breath. For hours they spoke. They spoke in Lakota, their voices rising and falling like the winter wind, a complex tapestry of debate, remembrance, and law. Corbin understood none of the words, but he understood the weight of them. He heard the name Matotanka spoken with reverence. He heard his own presence discussed with heat and gravity. He was not a person to them, not yet. He was a problem, a symbol, a white man, a former soldier, who had stumbled into the center of their grief. Finally, Inyangmani turned to him. An old man beside the chief, whose face was so wrinkled, looked like a dried riverbed, began to translate in slow, careful English. "The council has questions," the translator said. "Mato Tanka. You were with him when his spirit left." "I was," Corbin said, his voice hoarse. "He fought," the chief stated through the translator. "Did he fight well?" "He fought like a bear," Corbin answered. The image burned into his mind. He died protecting the child. A murmur went through the elders. The chief nodded slowly, a flicker of something pride, pain in his eyes. "He carried the coat of a soldier," the translator continued. "Did you give it to him?" Corbin shook his head. "He was holding a piece of it when I found him. It was from a soldier he killed. This was the truth. It was a good truth. But it wasn't the whole truth. The soldier he fought." Inyangmani's voice cut through the translation, his English suddenly sharp and clear. "He was from the 7th, Sibley's men." Corbin's blood turned to ice. "How do you know?" The chief's gaze was relentless. "We know their tracks. We know their smell. We have been hunting the men who did this. They rode from Fort Robinson." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You rode with the 7th. It was not a question. The world tilted. The air in. The lodge grew thick, heavy with the smoke of the past. "I did," Corbin confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "A long time ago." The elders leaned forward. The atmosphere shifted from judgment to something sharper, more dangerous. He was not just a white man. He was one of them. "I was at the Washita," he said, the words tasting like ash. He had to say it. He had to offer the whole of his rotten soul. "I left after that. I was discharged." The translator spoke with the chief, a rapid exchange of guttural sounds. Then he turned back to Corbin. "The chief, Inyangmani, says a man cannot leave the deeds of his past by walking away from them. They follow like a shadow." Corbin bowed his head. "I know." Then Inyangmani spoke again, and what he said shattered Corbin's understanding of the world. "There was a day," the chief said, his eyes boring into Corbin, "7 winters ago. At a place you call Crook Creek, Sibley gave an order to kill a small band of us women, old ones fleeing the agency. Most of his soldiers obeyed." He paused. "One did not. One soldier raised his rifle to the sky. He was shamed for it, cast out. But because his rifle was silent, a woman and her young sister escaped into the brush. They were the only ones." Corbin looked up, his mind reeling. He remembered. He remembered it with perfect, sickening clarity. The shouting, the chaos, the cold face of his commanding officer screaming the order, and his own hands trembling as he discharged his weapon into the empty air. The act that had ended his life as a soldier. "That woman," Inyangmani said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant hum, "was my wife. The young sister with her was my daughter, Anpo Wi." The breath left Corbin's body. He stared at the chief, unable to comprehend the shape of what was being revealed. This was the first shocking twist, a secret the land itself had kept. His act of shame had been their miracle, his disgrace, their survival. He had not simply found a child by a creek. He had been found by a history he never knew he had written. "Our medicine men have spoken of this," the chief continued, his voice taking on a mystical cadence. "They said the spirit of that soldier's act was not finished. They said he carried a burden of shame that was not his alone to carry. They saw a vision. They saw him standing by a frozen creek, between one of ours and death. Wiaka's survival was not an accident. It was the closing of a circle you opened when you aimed your gun at the sky." Corbin felt dizzy, unmoored from reality. He was not the rescuer. He was an instrument. A piece of a story so much larger than himself. A tale woven by spirits and visions he couldn't fathom. He had fled from his past only to run headlong into its most profound consequence. The warrior, Mato Tanka, the old translator said, his voice soft now, almost gentle. The man you helped die. He was not just protecting his daughter. Viyaka is not a child. Corbin's brow furrowed in confusion. He had held her. He had fed her. What did he mean? Inyang Mani leaned forward, and the final impossible truth fell into place. Viyaka has the gift, the sight. She does not see what is, but what is meant to be. The child you carried from the creek. She is the spirit of the child you lost. A soul given a home in our world to guide you back to yours. She is a bridge between your ghost and our living. It was too much. The revelation was a physical blow. The quiet, stoic child, the humming, the way she looked at him. It wasn't trauma. It was knowledge. She was not the ghost of his past, but the promise of a future he could not imagine. The second shocking twist wasn't a secret, but a spiritual truth beyond his comprehension. He stared at his hands, the hands that had refused an order, that had buried a soldier's coat, that had comforted a spirit child. He had thought he was performing small acts of kindness. He had been fulfilling a prophecy. He started, but no words came. What could a man say when he learns his life is not his own? He looked up at the circle of elders, at the powerful face of the chief. He saw no anger now. He saw something far more terrifying, destiny. He did the only thing that felt true. Punish me, he whispered, the request raw and broken. For the Washita, for the uniform I wore. For all of it. Let me pay for it. He begged for punishment, for a fire that would cauterize the wound in his soul. Inyang Mani considered him for a long moment. The firelight danced across his face. We do not punish a man for a debt he has already begun to pay, the chief said slowly. Your shame has been your punishment for many seasons. We do not give you the fire you ask for. He paused, and his next words were the most irrational, merciful thing Corbin had ever heard. We give you peace instead. We give you a life. A great fire was lit in the center of the village, a roaring column of flame that threw sparks up to kiss the stars. The entire tribe gathered, their faces painted by the dancing light. Drums began to beat, a slow, deep, resonant pulse that was not a sound, but the very heartbeat of the earth. It vibrated in Corbin's chest, in the solace of his feet. He stood beside Inyang Mani, feeling displaced, unreal. He watched as Anpo W., the widow of the man he had watched die, emerged from her lodge. She was no longer in the white doeskin of mourning. She wore a dress of the deepest blue, adorned with hundreds of tiny shimmering elk teeth, a symbol of wealth and status. Her hair was loose, flowing down her back. She was beautiful, but her beauty was a severe and powerful thing. Like a winter landscape. She walked toward the fire. Corbin's blood ran cold. He thought it was a funeral rite, a sati of the plains, a ritual of grief and finality. He thought she was going to join her husband in the spirit world, and that he was being made to witness the terrible cost of his interference. No, he said, taking a step forward. You can't. Inyang Mani's hand clamped down on his arm, a grip of iron. This is not your way, Corbin. This is our way. You will watch. But Anpa W did not walk into the fire. She stopped before it, her face lifted to the heat, her eyes closed. The drums grew louder, faster. The people began to chant, a rising melodic wave of sound. Then Viazayo, the child, emerged from the crowd. She, too, was dressed in ceremonial clothes. She walked to her mother's side and took her hand. Inyang Mani leaned close to Corbin, his voice a low rumble beneath the sound of the drums. A life has been taken from our people. Mato Tanka is gone. His body is with the earth, but his spirit is with us. His place in the circle, however, is empty. His duties are undone. His family is without a shield. Corbin watched, mesmerized, as Anpao W turned from the fire and walked toward him. Her eyes were not the eyes of a grieving widow. They were the eyes of a woman fulfilling a sacred duty. She stopped directly in front of him. The entire village fell silent. The only sound was the crackling of the great fire. "You came to our land wearing the blue coat of our enemies," Inyangmani said, his voice ringing out in the sudden quiet. "But you refused their path. You cast a stone of mercy into the water years ago, and the ripples have returned to you. You brought our chief's grandchild back from the edge of death. You honored a warrior's passing. You knelt in the snow and offered your life as payment for a debt you did not fully understand." The chief paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the crowd. "Our law is not your law. We do not believe in vengeance that leaves a family broken. We believe in balance. A warrior is gone. A protector is needed. An empty space must be filled." Corbin's mind could not grasp it. He felt the world shifting beneath his feet, the rules he had lived by dissolving into smoke. Anpo-Dui raised her hand. And it was not a weapon, not a stone of condemnation. It was a necklace of polished bear claws, Mato Tanka's necklace. The symbol of his strength, his spirit. She held it out. "The council has spoken," Inyangmani declared. "Anpo-Dui, daughter of our chief, widow of Mato Tanka, has the right to choose. She can remain a widow under my protection, or she can choose a man to take up her husband's duties, to be a father to his child and a shield for his lodge." She did not look at any of the warriors of her tribe. Her dark, powerful eyes were fixed on Corbin. It was not a proposal of love as his. People knew it. It was something far deeper, far more complex. It was a contract of spirit and responsibility, a burden and an honor. A command. They were not giving him a wife. They were giving him a life, a purpose, a people. They were asking him to become the thing he had once helped to destroy. It was a form of justice so profound, so alien to his world, it was beyond comprehension. He looked at her, at the strength in her face, the history in her eyes. He looked at Viaka, the spirit child who stood beside her, watching him with an ancient knowing. He looked at the fire, at the circle of faces, at the vast, star-dusted sky above. He had come here to die, in a way, to let his soul wither in solitude. They were offering him a way to live, but it would mean the death of the man named Corbin. He looked at Anpo-Dui and gave a slow, deliberate nod. She stepped forward and placed the bear claw necklace over his head. The weight of it was immense. The claws cool against his skin. It was done. It was sacred and irreversible. As she stepped back, Viaka came forward and placed the small wooden bird he had carved for her into his hand. Then she took his other hand, her small fingers wrapping around his. A new bloodline, a new life. The drums exploded. The chanting rose to a roar of approval. The fire leaped toward the sky. He was no longer a ghost haunting the edges of the world. He was anchored, claimed, remade. He never returned to the cabin on the mountain. His old life was a husk left behind in the snow. They gave him a new name, Tazaku Wanzadag, he who chose one path. He did not become a warrior. That was not his role. He was a guardian, a builder, a father. His marriage to Anpo-Dui was not one of whispered affections in the night. It was one of shared silence, of mutual respect built over a foundation of shared grief. It was a bond of duty that, over the slow turn of the seasons, deepened into a quiet, powerful understanding that was more resilient than any passion he had ever known. He learned the rhythm of their lives, the language of the earth. He learned to track not for the hunt, but to know which creatures had passed in the night. He learned the songs for the planting of corn and the prayers for the rising moon. He taught Viaka how to read the clouds for weather, but she taught him the true names of the stars in her own tongue, weaving him into the cosmology of her people. He was a bridge, a man who existed in the space between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, yet responsible to both. Years passed. The world outside the canyon changed. More bluecoats came, and then the men with the measuring chains and the iron horses that screened smoke. He stood with the tribe, his counsel valued for his knowledge of the white man's mind, his strange, sad foresight into their greed. He never held a gun against them. His role was different. He was a shield, as Nyangmani had foretold, but one of wisdom, not of war. One evening, many winters later, he sat by the fire in the center of the village, an old man now, his hair as silver as the chief's had been. Anpo Dui sat beside him, her hands busy mending a robe, their shared silence as comfortable as a warm blanket. Viaka, now a young woman with her mother's fierce grace and eyes that still saw more than the world showed, sat across the fire, telling a story to the children of the village. He looked into the flames, and for a moment, he saw the face of the man he had been, Corbin, the haunted exile, a stranger, a ghost. He felt a pang of something, not regret, but a deep, aching sense of the vast distance he had traveled. He had come to this land to take, as all his people had. He learned in the end only how to give. First his shame, then his name, then the rest of his life. He had given them what the bluecoats and the treaty men never did: time and blood and silence.